What's up, guys? Haven't talked about the grand solar minimum situation for a while because these are events that take place over 50 years and the knock on effects happen every 6 months to a year. So, are we going into a grand solar minimum? If you ask me, the effects of this kind of started back in 2019, but let's be thorough with all the terminology so everybody understands what's going on here. What's up, Chill Pill 1503? Got a full explanation for you. So, the sun naturally goes through 11-year cycles of solar maximum to solar minimum. Ultimately, I believe what it is a reversal of the sun's magnetic field, but the way we keep track of this is the number of sunspots, little tiny explosions on the sun. And yes, amateurs film these all the time, they're real. But solar maximum has a lot of sunspots, and then it wanes down to solar minimum every 11 years. I've even read that wildlife breed differently according to these patterns, and they use this as part of the farmer's almanac. And it's generally been a real steady cycle of ups and downs for the last couple hundred years because we've been living through a really good time in history. But there has been a weakening trend the last 4 solar cycles, and some have speculated that we might be going into a grand solar minimum, where overall temperatures can drop for 50, 100 years. And if you ask me, we started seeing the effects of this around 2019, 2020. Also, back in 2018, they mysteriously shut down the solar observatory for 11 days, and then came up with the story that the janitor had photos he wasn't supposed to have. But this observatory just stares at the sun all day. So did they see something for a few days there and they didn't want it getting out? Just saying. So on the larger time scale, we have the grand solar minimums and maximums. You can see on this chart we had below average temperatures for 150, 200 years from 1600 to 1800. It was a slight warming period, and then the Dalton minimum hit. And then we've lived in a warm, relatively stable climate for the last 200 years. In a minute, I'll show you what happened during the Dalton minimum in the early 1800s. But let's go back to further in time, because in the time frame of, they say 950 to 1250, we had the medieval warm period, a few hundred years of good, stable weather, just like we've had. And really what I mean by that is you're able to grow crops enough to sustain a society in the northern latitudes like England, North America, and not have raging storms that literally rip all of the topsoil away, because that's what happened after the medieval warm period. This is known as the Wolf minimum or the Sporer minimum, and was a very deep grand solar minimum. And this paper indicates that there was an intense solar proton event in the 13th century just prior to all of the weather turning off cold. So, solar flash, anyone? Now, I've done several videos and will do more about what actually happened in the 14th century. It was an event so big that they could not cover it up and just make it vanish and go away like they'd like to. So they just blame everything on the Black Death, a contagion. And that was part of it, but it was a series of cataclysmic events worldwide. I mean, I've got evidence of it in every culture. But you can see here how they play this down. They say, well, it started with bad weather in the spring. What they mean by bad weather, this is talking about England specifically here, is like 6 months of nonstop rain. It literally washed all of the topsoil away. And I've got accounts of earthquakes that, it took out complete towns, left big holes in the earth, a noxious fume coming forth, and anybody that was, in sniff range of that keeled over by the next day. Anyway, by the time it was all said and done, a huge portion of the population was no longer here. All of that happened before this chart, and then you had the same effects to a lesser degree during the Maunder minimum, and then even lesser degree or shorter time frame for the Dalton minimum. But since that is closer to us on the timeline, we have much better records of what actually happened during the early 1800s, so let's talk about that. I think of the Dalton minimum starting with the 1873 Lockheed volcanic eruption and then going all the way through to the 1830s. Before we go any further, you need to understand that we have a magnetosphere, a magnetic field around us. Even with the Earth being flat, we still see that compasses point north, and this is measurable by different instruments. So the sun has its magnetic field reversing every 11 years. It goes into a deep solar minimum and probably comes back on with a bang and seriously does something to Earth's magnetic field, especially with the electric universe theory. I mean, it does make sense that the electric fields of the sun and the Earth are connected. So with the weakening magnetic field, it allows in more charged particles, cosmic rays, and these in turn create volcanoes, earthquakes, and wreak all kinds of havoc on us. But all you really need to know is grand solar minimum, more earthquakes, more volcanoes. Also, aerial phenomena, plasma. Anyway, back to 1783, the start of the Dalton minimum, in my opinion. Now, this was really bad for the residents of Iceland. The livestock died by eating fluorine-contaminated grass, crop failure by acid rain, and they say that a quarter of the population perished during this event just a couple hundred years ago, not that long. Since this is at a northern latitude, then it only got circulated around this area of the northern hemisphere. Tree ring records in Alaska suggest that July and August were very cold. Russian traders in Alaska noticed a population decrease in the years after this eruption, while the Inuit oral histories refer to the summer that did not come. So a northern latitude, small-scale version of the Mount Tambora event that we'll get to in 1815. The ash cloud did travel over to Europe, but no catastrophic consequences of this. It inspired some really colorful sunset paintings, just like Krakatoa and Edward Munch's The Scream painting. And like I said, this 1783 eruption is kind of my personal beginning to the Dalton minimum, which they say technically started in 1790, but that's just when they started realizing that, hey, the temperatures are cooler than normal. Take a mental note of the reduced sunspot activity, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there was no major volcanic activity between 1783 and the mystery eruption of 1808. They saw the effects of it, but they didn't know where it came from. They estimate it to be a VEI 6, a rather large one, and then some smaller ones, two in 1812, 1813, and 1814. And then we get to the 1815 Mount Tambora eruption, which led to the year without a summer in 1816. Throughout the spring and summer of 1815, a persistent dry fog was observed. The fog reddened and dimmed the sunlight such that sunspots were visible to the naked eye. Neither wind nor rainfall dispersed the fog. In summer of 1816, countries in the northern hemisphere suffered extreme weather conditions dubbed the year without a summer, or 1800, and froze to death. On the 8th of June, the snow cover in Vermont was still reported at 18 inches. So this caused massive crop failures. It caused a migration. I heard of several wars between new European settlers encroaching on Native American lands during this time. And I actually just found this woodcut indicating there might have been a tsunami associated with this event. And I had never really thought of this before, but if the ash cloud is blocking out the sun and dimming the sun, then at night it would just be pitch black, no stars. It would be a really eerie situation. That would probably affect wildlife too, especially the nocturnal type. Another effect of this dry fog that I've read about is stagnant air. The wind doesn't blow, everything is just stifling. This article even mentions mysterious lights, which that's a lot of new stuff here I'm finding. I know it was associated with the New Madrid earthquake of 1812, which we'll get to in a second. But this is a full 4 years later, and they're saying that there were mysterious lights. Now back to the subject of reduced sunspots. Now it only makes sense that solar activity would affect the temperatures on Earth. And even the wizards at the Farmer's Almanac figure this into... What's up, Ruckus? Their forecasts on this 11-year cycle. But is it just decreased solar activity that is causing the major cooling? I should have mentioned this earlier, but all of the calamities in the 1300s were the start of what's also known as the Little Ice Age. But during all of these cooling cycles, there's basically a volcanic eruption associated with it. And I want to show you how this works because they write things out as fact all of the time, and this is strictly guesswork, speculation, and research on their part. For example, in 1600, right before the Maunder Minimum, we knew it was a big eruption, we knew it was a cold year, and that's all we knew. And they know this from tree ring data, and what they finally decided is that it was an eruption in Peru. So I don't know that it's so much a lessened sunspot count that causes the cooling as the cosmic particles are more likely to trigger a volcano, which then does cause the cooling. Now let's talk about the increased seismic activity associated with grand solar minimums, again using the Dalton minimum as a benchmark. In 1812, we had the New Madrid earthquakes. This is central USA around southern Missouri at the Mississippi River, and to me, there doesn't really even seem to be a fault line there, but it's a rabbit hole I don't want to get into right now. It certainly hasn't been very active in the last couple hundred years, but it did produce the largest, they say the largest on record. It's because they just ignore everything that happened before the 1800s. But from December 1811 through March of 1812, over 4 months, they estimate 6,000 to 10,000 earthquakes. It was just a nonstop 4-month ordeal. The larger ones were felt by James Madison in the White House. It rang church bells in Boston. I even heard that it was felt all the way down in Peru. They estimate the three largest being an 8.1, a 7.8, and as much as an 8.8. And this is a scale that is pretty mind-blowing. Some of the effects of this are that the Mississippi River ran backwards. They say due to the force of the land upheaval 15 miles south of New Madrid. This also caused Reelfoot Lake to form. This whole lake was not there before the earthquakes and was after. It drowned the inhabitants of an Indian village and thousands of acres of low-lying forest, now a lake. This was literally ripping the ground in two and causing huge crevices, and people noticed that the crevices were running from north to south, so they started chopping down trees in an east-west direction, and they would hold on to these trees when the earth started shaking real bad. There were, quote, missing people who were most likely swallowed up by the earth. Some earthquake fissures were as long as 5 miles. It caused the world's largest sand boil, 1.4 miles long, and the sand boil is subterranean sand that liquefies and is shot up like a geyser. In the sand boils are also seismic tar balls, which are small pellets up to a golf ball size tar ball that are petroleum that has been solidified. It caused earthquake lights, ball lightning. There's several different accounts of the way this goes down, but when you're looking at old woodcuts like this, the lightning isn't hyperbolic. It was really happening, presumably from a piezoelectric discharge, quartz in the ground getting high pressure and releasing a discharge. If you're not familiar, if you smack a quartz crystal with a hammer, it puts off a small electrical charge. Now, really large earthquakes will often cause water to seep up from the ground, but in this case they said that it was warm water, which is strange because usually the groundwater is quite cool to comparatively, like 60, 65 degrees. And here it's speculated that either friction was heating up the water or the piezoelectric quartz discharge was heating the water. Earthquake smog. The skies turned dark during the earthquakes, so dark that lighted lamps didn't help. The air smelled bad and it was hard to breathe. I also have accounts of the foul odor due to earthquakes in the 1300s, only it was lethal in that case. So if you're ever in a major earthquake and you smell something funny, try to get away from it and not breathe it. And of course, people reported strange behavior by animals. They were nervous and excited. Domestic animals became wild and wild animals became tame. Snakes came out of the ground from hibernation. flocks of ducks and geese landed near people. In the recent huge earthquake over in Turkey, there were quite a few people outside filming the birds at night because the birds were out at night going crazy and they didn't know why. And then the earthquake struck. And in case you've been on Mars this whole time, animals are tuned into the environment. They'll let you know when a thunderstorm's coming. Ruckus lets me know what's up, or that he just needs some tension. So that's a decent synopsis of what happened during the Dalton minimum, and you can basically take that, cut it, and paste it, and put it in for the Maunder minimum and the Sporer minimum, only they lasted longer. And the Wolf minimum, what actually happened back in the 1300s at the start of the Little Ice Age, I am convinced is a big cover-up that they just say was the Black Death. It was really cataclysmic climate change, and you can't know that because there's billions of dollars being funneled into, yeah. So are we heading into a grand solar minimum right now? There's been a weakening solar cycle the last 4 cycles. And if you look at the macro timescale, it seems like we're about due for one because we've had our modern maximum pretty much the longest in history since the medieval warm period. Valentina Zarkova was a scientist that was getting a lot of attention around, 2020 or so, when a lot of people started waking up to the idea of the grand solar minimum. And she basically says, yes, we are going into one. And here's my take on things, just as a clueless YouTuber, right, Mercedes? Nobody knows for sure that it is the decreased sunspot count that actually is causing the cooling. And it seems like there's volcanic activity involved with every one of these cooling cycles. So if you look again at the Dalton minimum events, you had 1808, a VEI 6, rather large one, and then 4 smaller ones before the Mount Tambora. Each one of these are spraying particulates, sulfur dioxide, up into the stratosphere, troposphere, and blocking sunlight, making it get cooler. So if you were to take our current cycle that we're going through and put Hunga Tonga right there at the 1808 mystery eruption, then that would be the first eruption in a series that caused major cooling. And just from my personal observations, it seems like it has definitely been cooler since that happened. And we had a very short summer last year. I remember specifically August 15th. That was it. Summer was done. It dropped down to 20 degrees, what normal temperatures are for here. And then we had a very long, very cold winter. This is one of the worst winters I can remember. I got snowed and iced out of work twice, one of them was for about 2 or 3 weeks. That's not normal for me. And then we had a nice cool spring. This is one of the best springs that I can remember because it didn't just flash straight to 100 degrees and miserable. But for me, what really flipped the switch was I was living in Southern California. I'd moved back from Northern California in 2020, and the weather patterns had changed. They were consistent for the last 10 years that I lived there, and it had completely changed. It started raining and rained nonstop. I thought some of the bluffs did fall in, and I thought more were going to fall in. But the last few years, the weather patterns seem to have changed, and then in the last year, it really seems to have cooled down. I mean, they had record snowpack in the Sierra Nevadas all through California, roofs caving in. It was pretty heavy-duty snow this year. So I would probably argue that the cooling effects of a grand solar minimum are more volcanic in nature than solar activity, but it's the solar activity and weakening magnetic field that causes the volcanism. We're currently heading into solar maximum of the 11-year cycle, and if you want to keep up with the solar activity, go watch Suspicious Observers. But with our weakening magnetic field, some of the smaller solar events are having much greater effect than they normally would. How many geomagnetic storms have you heard of in the last year? We keep seeing northern lights, as far south as, I think, Tennessee even saw them. But the more important thing there is if we have a huge solar outburst directly aimed at us and we have a weakening magnetic field, then we'll have basically like the Carrington event in the 1800s where everything gets fried. I mean, it literally set the power poles on fire. So just think if every structure that has electricity running to it caught on fire. There's your bedtime story, kids. Now go to sleep. Static out.